Hi everyone, it's Marianne and welcome to MYWASTELESSLIFE. In this episode of Houseplants Back to Basics, we're going to talk about fertilizing our houseplants. So we're going to go over three things in this video. First is when to fertilize, second, what type of fertilizer to use, and third, how to fertilize. So when to fertilize. So if you're watching this now at the beginning of April, then this is the time to start fertilizing our houseplants, or at least start thinking about fertilizing our houseplants. Officially, we should start fertilizing our houseplants during the beginning of the growing season, and the usual indicator of that is when is your last frost date. For me, I'm in Maryland. My last frost date is around April 15. But since most of our houseplants are indoors, does it really matter when is our last frost date or not? For me, that you don't really necessarily have to know your last frost date, but if you want a specific date to actually start fertilizing your houseplants, then go look it up online when is your last frost date depending on your location. But generally, it's the beginning of spring and when we have longer days than nights, and more importantly, you start seeing your plants pushing out new growth. So those are the more important indicators of when to know to start fertilizing your houseplants than looking up your last frost date. And even though most of our plants is indoors, especially if we are more dependent on natural light for lighting for our plants, it's important for houseplants that they are getting sufficient light for them to be able to process the nutrients that we're giving them. Otherwise, they get overfed, and overnutrients for houseplants can be very detrimental for them as well. So you don't have to rush into fertilizing your houseplants yet if you're not sure if you should fertilize them now or not. So second, what type of fertilizers we should use for our houseplants. So when you go to a garden center or to a nursery, you'll see tons of different fertilizers. But for houseplants, it's not that complicated. You could pretty much use one type of fertilizer for all of your houseplants. And there are several different types of fertilizers. You can go the synthetic route, the organic route, or the homemade route. For me, there doesn't really much difference between synthetic or organic, just because we are not consuming our houseplants, we're not growing them to eat. So for me, it doesn't really matter if you use synthetic or organic. But the advantage of using organic fertilizer versus synthetic fertilizer, in my opinion, most synthetic fertilizers have a higher ratio of NPK, which we'll be discussing in a little while if you're not sure what NPK ratio means. And usually for the synthetic fertilizers, they have like 3-4 times the amount of NPK than our houseplant needs. And so organic fertilizers tend to have lower NPK ratio that is more appropriate for houseplants. So for me, that's the primary reason that I choose organic fertilizer, just because their NPK ratio is more suitable for our houseplants compared to synthetic ones. I'm not saying you can't use synthetic fertilizer if that's what you have available to you. You just have to be mindful of how much you use, and usually you have to cut it in half or even in a quarter each time you use a synthetic fertilizer for your houseplants. And with organic fertilizers, you could pretty much just follow the instructions on the packaging, and that would be just right for your houseplants. And fertilizers often come in two forms, which is granular or liquid. For most plant parents, we tend to prefer liquid fertilizer just because there's less chance of burning or overfeeding our houseplants, even if we fertilize weekly. And also with liquid fertilizers, our houseplants absorb the nutrients a lot easier than if it's a granular fertilizer, which is often a slow release. So when choosing fertilizers for your houseplants, it doesn't really matter the brand, because often you'll get recommendation of brands, but what you really should keep in mind is what is the NPK ratio of the fertilizer. So because you can get many different types of fertilizers that says, oh, this one is a specific fertilizer for fiddle fig, this one is specific for a monstera, or this one is specific for pothos, for cacti, etc., etc. But sometimes when you look at them, they all have the same NPK ratio, which is often you'll find in many liquid fertilizers for houseplants. Even the specialized ones have the NPK ratio of 3:1:2. So NPK stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen is for the foliage and vegetation. Phosphorus is for the roots, for the flowering, and for the fruits. And potassium is to promote the overall health of our houseplants. Mostly they need, especially if they're already established plant, is nitrogen. So most of the houseplant fertilizer that you would see would have a 3:1:2 NPK ratio, which is, I think, the best NPK ratio for houseplants: 3 nitrogen, 1 phosphorus, and 2 potassium, because like I said, for our houseplants, we mostly encourage the foliage, and we don't really have houseplants, or at least not a lot of them, that we grow for their flowers or to bear fruit. So in choosing your fertilizer, whether it's granular or liquid, just make sure it's within the ratio of 3:1:2. It could be a little bit higher or a little bit lower. That's fine. So it doesn't really matter the brand or if it's a specialized fertilizer. Just look at the NPK ratio. If it's within the range of 3:1:2 NPK ratio, then it's good for your houseplant. So what fertilizers do I use for my houseplant? Last year, I used earthworm casting and this fertilizer, which is a specialized fertilizer for fiddle fig. It's a 3:1:2 NPK ratio. Even though it's a fertilizer that's specific for a fiddle fig, I use that liquid fertilizer for all of my houseplants because it has a 3:1:2 NPK ratio. I didn't fertilize all of my houseplants, to be honest, and not all of your houseplants would require regular fertilization. Most of them would probably just require fertilization at the beginning of the growing season. Some of them would probably just require fertilization every 3 months, some every month, and some every other week or even once a week. It really just depends on the size of the plants that you have and the type of plant that you have. For this growing season, I am using Espoma's Plant Tone. I'm trying this one out. This is a granular organic slow release fertilizer. It has an NPK ratio at 5:3, and to be honest, for me, that's actually a little bit high for my houseplants, since most of my houseplants tend to be smaller. So I'm actually cutting that in half whenever I add it to my soil mixture. And for our liquid fertilizer, I am using this fish emulsion fertilizer, which has a NPK ratio of 5:1:1. So this one is mostly nitrogen and has a little bit of phosphorus and potassium, and this is good for my established plants. And the only reason that I'm using this instead of the liquid fertilizer that I'm using last year is this one is a lot cheaper and I get a lot more for the price. I think this one was around $9 or $11 depending on where you get it. But the only thing about the fish emulsion fertilizer, it does have a smell. It does have the anchovy smell, which might bother you. It bothers me a little bit, to be honest. It's not a very strong smell, but it does linger a little bit in your plants. So if that bothers you, or if you're using it to water your plants like with me in my bedroom, that's probably a fertilizer that you might not want to use for your houseplants because it would make your plants smell bad a little bit. For right now, for most of us, we are probably under a stay-at-home order, and going out and buying fertilizers might not be an option for us right now. So an option you can take is to create your own fertilizers at home. And this is a great way to also reduce your food waste. And some of the everyday items that you could use to create your fertilizer is eggshells, used coffee grounds, banana peels, and you can let them sun dry because it's important for any of these homemade fertilizers that they are completely dry before you use them, especially if you're adding them to your soil mix, because if you add them wet, and they're just going to help create mold or help create fungi. So make sure that they are completely dry before you add them to your soil mix, whether as a top dress or you're mixing them up in your soil when you are repotting your plants. So with eggshells, after I dry them up, like I said, I either sun dry them or put them in the oven or put them in the microwave. So once they're completely dry, I just put them in the food processor, let it get into a powder form as close as it can be. And then I just store them and I use it whenever I need it. Same with the coffee grounds. After I make my coffee, I just save the coffee grounds. You have to use used coffee grounds. You can't use fresh coffee grounds because fresh coffee grounds have very high acidic level, and that's not good for your plants. But once you have used the coffee grounds to make your coffee, its pH level becomes neutral. So now the coffee grounds is now okay to use as fertilizers for your houseplants. And then same with banana peel, you can chop them up, let them sun dry, put them in the oven to dehydrate them, and then after that, same with eggshells, put them in your blender or food processor just to grind them up into a near powder form, and I use that for my houseplants. So for eggshells, I use it a lot for my Hoyas because eggshells make the soil sweeter, and that's what Hoyas prefer. For these homemade fertilizers, the eggshells, banana peel, and the coffee grounds, they are going to act as a slow release fertilizers, so don't be too scared to use them on your houseplants unless you go really overboard with the amount that you use. There's really very little chance of overfeeding your houseplants using eggshells, coffee ground, or banana peels. And another one that I use is Epsom salt. I take about a tablespoon of Epsom salt and I mix it with a gallon of water, and that's what I use to water my houseplants from time to time. So Epsom salt is magnesium sulfate, and magnesium and sulfur is also two other nutrients that is very beneficial to help promote the health of your houseplant. And if you're unsure how your houseplants are going to react to Epsom salt solution, then just try it a little bit. Start with a half a tablespoon or even a quarter tablespoon, and then go up until you reach a tablespoon to see how your plants react to them. Because for me, Epsom salt solution water works well for my seedlings, because I also grow vegetables and perennials and annuals for my outdoor garden, and that's what I use for my seedlings and transplants right now. And I've also been using them for my houseplants, and so far they've taken to it very well. But there are other solutions that I use for my vegetable garden that my houseplants hates. Like I tried using a baking soda solution for my houseplants. Terrible idea. Don't ever do that. So just make sure if you're using any of these homemade solutions, if it's just meant for the soil and for the roots of your plants, then just make sure it touches only the roots and the soil of your plants and not the foliage. And another homemade fertilizer that you can make is compost. Most of us are cooking at home a lot now, and hopefully the stuff that we're cooking at home includes lots of vegetables and fruits. So what you could do is to take your vegetable and fruit scraps and compost them. In my first Garden With Me vlog, I showed how I make homemade compost. So it's basically collecting your vegetable and fruit scraps and then putting them into a bin that you could put outside, and you mix it with some dry materials, which could be newspapers, the carton packaging that you get when you online shop. You could tear those up. Also use grass clippings, dry leaves from outside, small twigs to add to your compost. And it's gonna take a while for this to break down, especially the weather is still a bit cooler. In the summer months, the composting would probably speed up a bit more. So that's not something that you could use right away, but you could also use your vegetable scraps and your fruit scraps to make compost tea. So basically what you're doing is just take all your food scraps, boil them just to get all the nutrients into the water, then strain them and let the water cool down, and then use that to water your plants. And that is a lot quicker than waiting for your vegetable scraps and your fruit scraps and your newspaper and all of that to turn into actual compost. But it's not a bad idea to start a compost bin now, whether you're living in an apartment or if you have space outside your house to be able to compost. There are many different ways that you could compost at home, but it's very important to keep in mind to not put any food waste in our compost, and do not put any animal waste in our compost, because it will just stink up and you wouldn't want that. So yeah. So how to fertilize your houseplants. So a few weeks ago, I did a video on how to flush your houseplants, and I would recommend doing that before you start fertilizing your houseplants again. Flushing your houseplants just basically prepare your houseplants for the growing season, and making sure that the soil of your plants, especially if you're not repotting your houseplants, that they are ready to receive the nutrients, and making sure the soil is ready to properly absorb the nutrients that you're feeding it. And flushing your houseplants also helps if you accidentally over fertilized your houseplants. So if you haven't seen that video, go check it out. The link is somewhere up here, and I'll also add the link down in the description. So if you're using a granular fertilizer, there are two ways you could do that. One is adding the granule fertilizer in your top dress of your houseplants if you're not repotting it. And second is adding the granular fertilizer in the soil mix that you're going to use to repot your plants. So for the most part, you could follow the instructions on the packaging of the fertilizer on how much you're going to use. But like I said, keep in mind the NPK ratio of the fertilizer. If it's very high, then I would suggest cutting it half, or maybe cutting it into a quarter if you're adding it into soil mix, especially if you plan on also using liquid fertilizer for your plants in addition to the slow release granular fertilizer that you're already adding to the soil mix for your houseplants. And usually once you add the granular fertilizer for your houseplants, those houseplants don't really need to be fertilized anymore for the entire growing season for most houseplants. Like honestly, for pothos, if you're adding like earthworm castings or any biotone or plant tone to your pothos when you repot them or when you top dress them, they don't really need fertilizing for the rest of the growing season for pothos. And I also find it that pothos don't like to be overfed. I accidentally did that with my neon pothos, and a lot of the leaves started to yellow after I repotted it with planktone. And it was, even if I already cut the planktone in half, it was still too much for the neon pothos. And now it's doing fine, but I lost a lot of leaves in my neon pothos because I overfed it. And last year, aside from the earthworm castings in my pothos, I didn't really fertilize them at all. I just water it with regular water or with rainwater. So for a lot of your houseplants, like for your succulents and stuff, they don't really need fertilization. And if they do, they only need it once per growing season, maybe every 3 months, depending on how large they are. If you're already using granular slow release fertilizer on them, then usually those fertilizers last for 3 months, sometimes 6 months. So just read the packaging of your granular fertilizer to see how long they last for the houseplants and just go by that schedule. And sometimes we also like to feed it with liquid fertilizer, even though we already added a granular slow release fertilizer to houseplants. Just be mindful that some plants won't be able to take being overfed that much. Like I said, with pothos, maybe even with your Hoyas, succulents, cacti, they're probably not gonna like it that much if you fertilize them that often and that much, especially for your smaller plants, no matter what variety they are. If you're using a liquid fertilizer, then you have to kind of sync that up with your watering schedule. The plants that I used liquid fertilizers on last year and that I fertilized every other week were my larger plants, which is my Ficus lyrata, my Monstera deliciosa, and my Thamatophyllum binatophyllum. So the bigger plants that I have, those are the ones that I fertilized every other week with a liquid fertilizer. And I don't think I added any granular fertilizer on them in an earthworm casting. So because they're still pretty much in the same soil that they came in when I first bought them. For the Monstera deliciosa that I already repotted, and even with this one, I added planktone when I repotted it. If you watched my Monstera repotting video, I probably still use a liquid fertilizer because it is a larger plant. I probably wouldn't use liquid fertilizer on it as often as I did last year. Last year I was feeding it with liquid fertilizer every other week. This time I'm only going to feed it liquid fertilizer every 20 or 30 days. But just be mindful of the schedule of your fertilizing because you don't want to overfeed your plants. And in my opinion, it is better to underfeed your houseplants. Our houseplants don't really need a lot of nutrients in order to survive. So I rather skip a fertilization than over fertilize my houseplants. I don't really recommend fertilizing your plants every week, even if you're using just a 1-1-1 liquid fertilizer. Our houseplants don't really need that much nutrients in order to thrive, survive, and it could even be detrimental for them. So, and like I said, err on the side of caution. If you're not sure if you should fertilize your houseplants, don't fertilize your houseplants. In my opinion, this is an opinion, not a fact. Your houseplant, as long as it's getting the right amount of light, the right amount of water, and it's in a good soil, then that's all your plant really needs to survive. And fertilization and adding nutrients to it is just an added bonus for them. So don't stress too much about fertilizing your plants, especially right now if you don't have access to them because of what's going on in the world right now. But yeah, that's it for this Houseplants Back to Basics, fertilizing our houseplants. If you have any questions for me, please leave them down in the comment below, or if you have any other ideas or suggestions for everyone else, also leave them down in the comments. Thanks again for watching. If you like it, please give me a thumbs up. If you're new here, I hope you subscribe. I come up with houseplant and sustainable lifestyle videos every week. And if you haven't yet, go check out these videos out here until my next one. But until then, I see you. I appreciate you. Take care of yourself and each other and have a plentiful day. Bye.